Securities and advisory services are offered through LPL Financial, LPL, a registered investment advisor and broker-dealer, member FINRA and SIPC. Insurance products are offered through LPL or its licensed affiliates. Bank of Springfield and BOS Wealth and Planning are not registered as a broker-dealer or investment advisor. Registered representatives of LPL offer products and services using BOS Wealth and Planning and may also be employees of Bank of Springfield. These products and services are being offered through LPL or its affiliates, which are separate entities from and not affiliates of Bank of Springfield or BOS Wealth and Planning. Securities and insurance offered through LPL or its affiliates are not insured by FDIC or any other government agency, not Bank of Springfield guaranteed, not Bank of Springfield deposits or obligations, and may lose value.
This is BankCents, the podcast that makes sense of all things banking. If there's something you don't understand about banking or finances, you're not alone. Our industry experts are bringing you informative and enjoyable conversations to break down bank jargon and dive into hot-button financial topics. And now, BOS, a community bank located across Illinois and Missouri, presents BankCents. Here's your host, Gregory Morantz.
Hi, and welcome back to BankCents, the podcast that makes sense of all things banking. I'm your host, Greg Morantz, Executive Vice President here at the Bank of Springfield. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about things that you should consider as we near retirement. On today's episode, I'm excited to have on Max Cook, an advisor here with BOS Wealth and Planning in our Springfield market, to talk about this topic. Max, welcome.
Greg, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Before we dive into the topic, can you give our listeners a little bit of background about how long you've been doing advising and how long you've been at the bank?
Yeah, so I have been a financial advisor for almost 5 years now. I work on a team of advisors with it's myself, Drew Davis, and Joshua Jacoby. And yeah, I've been with the bank for almost 5 years now.
Yeah, and we're excited to have you as part of our team. And really, I think you're a perfect person to have on today to talk about things you consider as you near retirement. And I think one thing we really want to pass on to our listeners, because you may think you don't need to worry about this if you're at a younger age, maybe you're in your 20s or 30s, but really, I think there's no perfect time to start planning for your retirement than today. So this really applies for everyone that's going to be listening today. And I think that leads us into our first topic, and that's talking about some things you should consider when you're looking at your retirement analysis, and that's your income and expenses you're looking at to really understand what you're going to need for retirement.
Yeah, absolutely, Greg. So the retirement, thinking about retirement, whether you're a year out, you're 3 years out, 5 years out, 10 years out, it can be a pretty anxious topic for a lot of people. I will say that the most important thing, and it's very basic, is retirement is the same as when you're working. It's all about income versus expenses. And where we really like to start with people, when they come in the door and talk with us, is if they say, okay, Max, I'm thinking about retiring in 5 years. We're going to ask them, okay, what are your expenses? A lot of people who come through the door really don't know what they truly spend. And sometimes they get a little surprised by what they're spending. But that's really where we have to start from. And just very basic, all you got to do is go back and look at maybe your last 6 months to a year of bank statements, and that'll give you an idea of what you're spending per month. Yeah. And then from there, we take a look at those expenses, and what we're trying to do is generate an income stream that's going to last you for the rest of your life, that's going to cover those expenses.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point. It seems very simple. Right, and it's really hard for people to do that. And we've actually had some previous episodes on BankCents that have talked about budgeting, what you should do as you're going throughout your life. And so it's, as you mentioned, it's not that different as you're planning for retirement. And it's a first easy step that you can do to really help plan for that and really understand your expenses. But obviously, there's the other side of the coin as well when it comes to income streams.
Yes.
So can you talk about a few of the income streams that you might see with different individuals? Obviously, every individual's path is different.
Yeah.
So maybe just a few examples that you see.
Yeah. So the most common types are retirement accounts. You're going to have your traditional IRAs, your Roth IRAs. There may be some non-retirement money as well, and then Social Security, which is obviously a government program that most people have been putting into for their entire working lives. And when you turn the age of 62, you are eligible, to start receiving Social Security benefits.
Okay. Do you have to start taking Social Security at 62?
You do not have to start taking at 62, but 62 is the earliest you can start taking. That is something that we as advisors will generally talk with our clients about, is the Social Security and doing some Social Security planning. The reality is that a lot of people that come in, they say, look, I've been putting into this for 40 years. I want to start taking it at 62. And we say, okay, that's fine. We get that. But every year that you wait, you get roughly a 7.5% guaranteed increase. Wow. So if you wait until 67, which is full retirement age for most people nowadays, you're going to get a 7.5% increase each year that you wait. So that is something that you'll want to take into consideration, is that, okay, maybe if I have other assets that can cover my income, I can afford to wait.
Yeah.
And so that is something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the benefits of talking to an advisor as well, is that, as I mentioned previously, every situation is unique. And so it may make sense for somebody to take it right at 62, but for them to wait potentially to 67 or even longer, that might make sense as well. It just depends on each individual's situation. One of the other things I think you have to take in consideration is if you're married and you have a spouse and their Social Security or their income as well. Can you talk a little bit about strategies that might include when you're discussing that with your spouse?
Yeah. So I would say a very common strategy that we've utilized in our practice is the spousal strategy. So let's say you have a higher income earning spouse and a lower income earning spouse. If the higher income earning spouse waits until their full retirement age at 67, and the lower income earning spouse starts taking their Social Security at 62, when that higher income earning spouse starts to take their benefit at 67, the lower income earning spouse can actually elect to start taking spousal benefits, which means they would get half of what the higher income earning spouse was receiving. Okay. So let's say the higher income earning spouse was set to receive $4,000 in benefits, and the lower income earning spouse was set to receive $1,000. Well, instead of $1,000, they would then get $2,000.
Okay.
And so that is a common strategy that we've seen in our practice. There's never a one size fits all for this, and that's why, like you said, we believe it's important that you talk with an advisor, because we have like calculators and planning tools that we can use to help find the best fit for each particular client.
Yeah. And one of the things you're going to talk about when you meet with an advisor as well, and we won't go too far into this topic because it can be very vast and complicated, but as you age, it's the healthcare expenses that are associated with getting older just in general. Can you just talk very briefly about that? We don't want to get too in the nuts and bolts. We could go on for hours about healthcare.
Yeah, absolutely. So the main federal program that most people are aware of is Medicare. So when you turn 65, you do become eligible for Medicare, which is a government program that helps cover the cost of insurance. But if you decide to retire before 65, which a lot of people we work with generally, would like to retire before 65, you have to keep in mind that the cost of health insurance is going to be a major factor there in those years prior to Medicare. So there's a couple things you can look at. You can generally stay on your employer's plan. Let's say you decide to retire at 60. You can stay on your employer's plan through COBRA. Okay. That's going to be there's going to be a cost associated with that, though. Or maybe if you have a younger spouse that's still working, you could try to get on their plan. But if you're having to go into the individual marketplace, you could be looking at $1,000 to $2,000 per month easy in costs. It all depends. We, like you said, we could really talk about this. There could be a whole other episode about this. But you've got to understand, if you're going to retire before 65, you need to know or have an idea of what those costs are going to be in your particular situation.
Yeah. So I think we talked about some income streams and some expenses that you're going to have, and the healthcare expenses obviously being a big part of that. But going into a little bit more detail, can you talk to us a little bit about some tax planning strategies that you've seen occur with some clients? Yes,
I can. So I think the biggest planning strategy, and I guess before we jump into that, I will say that our team, we don't actually file tax returns for our clients. But we obviously, in our industry, we have to have a very high knowledge of taxes and how they work. So like we talked about before, most people when they retire, they're going to have pre-tax retirement money and or Roth retirement money. One thing that we think almost everybody should be doing if you have pre-tax money when you get into retirement is you should be looking at doing Roth conversions. So a Roth conversion is very simply taking pre-tax money that you have and converting it into a Roth. So why would we do this? There are many different benefits for it. One, when you retire, you are finally in position to be able to control your income way better than you ever were while you were working. Mm-hmm. So we believe that when you retire, whether it be at 60 or 62, you are going to have, a sweet spot there before you're required to take money out of your pre-tax money in the form of RMDs, required minimum distributions. We believe you want to take those years and start doing Roth conversions, moving money into a Roth. Because in a Roth, it's going to grow tax-free forever. Mm-hmm. So what we generally do with our clients is we will help them come up with a plan and potentially move chunks each year into a Roth. Okay. And we recommend if you're retired and you're not doing that, I would ask your financial professional why you're not. And if you're approaching retirement, that's something that you're going to want to make sure that you do when you get into retirement.
Yeah. And I think the benefit of, converting to a Roth or putting money into a Roth in the first place is obviously taking out the uncertainty of what the tax rates might be, because that's obviously always changing.
Absolutely.
So obviously, Roth conversions are a huge way to take out some of that uncertainty with your income streams as you retire. But what are some additional withdrawal strategies that you may suggest or you want to talk about for our listeners?
Yes. So I know we talked about income versus expenses, at the start of the show, and the big reason why we need the expenses is because we're trying to generate an income that's going to cover those expenses for the duration of someone's life. So the main rule that we like to follow is the 4% rule. So let's say that we determine that an individual is going to need $80,000 in retirement, and Social Security is going to provide $40,000. So now we know that we need to generate $40,000 from other income streams, such as pre-tax money or Roth money, non-retirement money. We know we're going to need $40,000 from that. What we would do is we're working backwards on that, and we're saying, okay, if we need $40,000, how much money do we need in total in those other accounts to provide that $40,000? If you follow the 4% rule, that means you would actually need $1 million in retirement to generate that 4%, because 4% of $1 million is $40,000. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so that's you could be at 4 or 5%, but the idea behind that, Greg, is that if you can only take out 4 or 5% in retirement, if you are even moderately invested in your portfolio, your returns are probably going to outpace that 4 or 5% that you're taking out. And so therefore, you're never going to run out of money. And in fact, if you're doing 4% and you're moderately invested, you may get 6, 7, 8%, depending on how the market does. Your money may actually grow instead of starting to come down as you're getting your later years of retirement.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think that's one thing about the 4% rule. I think a lot of people, when they have all this uncertainty as they retire, they're just really concerned they're going to run out of money, and they don't want to pass on that burden to their children or whoever might have to help them as they get older. So I think it's a great rule to abide by. And as we've mentioned previously in the episode a couple of times, every person's situation is so unique. So I think the 4% rule can apply for a lot of people, but it may be different for some people as well. So it depends on, the lifestyle you live and all these other factors that it's really hard to nail down and get into until you really take a hard look at those statements with an advisor like Max.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to go off that, like Social Security, let's say you decide to retire at 62, but you really would like to try to delay your Social Security. Maybe in those early years in retirement, you're taking out 6 or 7% because you're going to start taking that Social Security later. Yeah. That's a strategy that we see, and we're okay with that as advisors. But what that means is that you do need to try to dial back your spending when you start the Social Security. That's kind of the give and take there. But yeah, that is, like you said, just all the more reason why you should sit down with a financial professional and talk with them about your options.
Yeah, I think there's just a lot of balance to it. I mean, we obviously talked a lot about income and expenses and highlighted areas about Social Security is obviously a big part of everyone's retirement. So you really need to understand that and understand what makes sense for you. We obviously talked about, one of the biggest costs as you get older is that those healthcare expenses. Touched on the tax planning as well as the additional withdrawal strategies. And I really hope our listeners take away that 4% rule that you mentioned, because I think that is something that can really make sense for people. Looking at if you take out 4% and your investments are doing well, hopefully in an ideal situation that you won't run out of money.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And to just go off of that, it is also going to be important how you're invested. Mm-hmm. So if you are invested, in retirement, all in CDs or all in a money market, that may be a little differently than if you were invested in, say, a 60% stock, 40% bond portfolio, which for your listeners is kind of the average portfolio that we would see within our practice. What we generally like to do with retirees is I would say a baseline maybe 60% stocks, 40% bonds. What we do is we do a tiered approach with that. So you could divide your assets into 3 tiers. So you're going to have your more aggressive risk on assets, your aggressive stocks, those types of things. That's going to be tier 3. Mm-hmm. Tier 2 is more of your moderately risky assets, such as maybe high yield corporate bonds or value stocks, dividend payers, etc. And then tier 1, that's tier 2. And then tier 1 would be your safer assets, so your money market funds, government bonds, etc. Yeah. And so the approach that we're taking there is we're saying, okay, let's say you have $1 million and we're dividing your assets into those 3 tiers. And you need to take out that $40,000 like we talked about per year. We're going to be taking that money from your safest assets, always. Mm-hmm. So what we're trying to do there is we're trying to take that money from your tier 1 safe assets. We're trying to structure that out for the next 3 to 5 years. So what does that say? If there's a market downturn, we're not selling things that are at a huge loss. Sure. Mm-hmm. We're not selling your most aggressive stocks. So that's kind of the big thing that we talk about, is that you don't have to get totally risk off in retirement, which we believe is the common conception out there, is that you want to, when you retire, you really want to take de-risk, and you may want to do that to an extent, when, depending on where you're at when you were working. But the truth is that you don't have to get totally risk off in retirement, and in fact we actually generally recommend that you don't do that, because we can structure your assets in such a way that even if the market goes down, you're still going to be fine because of how we're taking the money out of your portfolio. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and I think really what it comes back to is looking at the whole picture, and sitting down with an advisor, similar to yourself, and really understanding what your goals are for retirement. And your retirement planning, and what your risk appetite is as well, because my risk appetite might not be the same as yours, and that's okay, because everyone has different feelings, gets nervous about different stuff. So I think that's what's so beneficial about meeting with an advisor, is that it can be customizable between myself and yourself, depending on how we feel about certain things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's not to say that if somebody comes in, we're going to tell them, hey, you need to be taking this amount of risk, because like you said, everybody's different. Everybody has a different risk tolerance. So that is part of what we do, is we're going to assess that, and then we're going to work with our clients on coming up with a plan that meets them. But we do try to educate our clients and just tell them, hey, you do not have to be 100% in bonds or in the money market just because you're retired now. Sure. In fact, that may not be the best way to go.
Yeah. Well, Max, I really appreciate you coming on today and navigating the topic of retirement planning. It's very complicated, and we just brushed the surface of the topic. There's a lot more we could expand on, but I think it really gives our listeners a good background and an understanding of maybe some goals to set up, and understanding, what you want to do and what your goals are for your retirement. And as I mentioned previously, I don't think there's any better time to start planning for your retirement than today. You don't want to necessarily wait till you're 55 and you're going to retire in 5 to 7 years. You need to start planning for that now, when you're in your 20s or your 30s or 40s. So really, this episode isn't just specifically towards those people that are near retirement. It's for anyone out there.
Yes.
Because retirement is such an important part of your planning, unless you want to work the rest of your life.
Yes, absolutely. And I would say for the younger listeners, whether in your 20s or 30s, the big thing that I would say is just please start doing something.
Yeah.
That's if I were to ever give any advice, please start doing something. And then, yes, as you get closer to retirement, don't wait until you're a year out before you go see somebody. At least try to be, in the 5 to 10 year range. So then you really have an idea of, okay, here's where I need to get to in order to be totally comfortable in retirement.
Yeah. Well, Max, thanks again for coming on today. We really appreciate your time and taking time out of your busy schedule to come on BankCents and helping inform our listeners about retirement planning. As always, thanks for listening to BankCents, the podcast that makes sense of all things banking. Until next time.
Is there something about banking that doesn't make sense to you? Submit your questions to us on Instagram Messenger or by email, BankCents@bankwithbos.com. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, comment below. We're happy to give you our 2 cents on a wide range of topics. Thank you for listening on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please leave us a 5-star rating and review so we can continue to bring you more educational content. Thank you for listening, and we hope you join us on the next episode of BankCents.